OCR Sociology A level, paper 2 is in a week's time. Paper 2 contains a 40 marker question. Now, most people get scared that it's 40 marks, but I think the 40 marker is easy once you've got it. Once you have the structure, it's fine. You can bosh out 10. So this is my ultimate guide to get full marks on the 40 markers, coming from someone who did get 40 marks on the 40 marker. Basically, the 40 markers can be asked two ways. Type 1 is assess or evaluate a view. So in the question, it will say assess or evaluate, and then it gives a view. This view usually stems from a perspective or a theory. So that's your functionalists, your marxists, your feminists, your weberians, your new rights. For example, assess the view that in the UK, status and financial reward is based on individual talents and efforts. So that's a statement. Type 1, it gives you a statement. That statement is a functionalist statement. But important thing to note there, you could work that statement to be new right as well. So that it's a type 1's a broader question. It's giving you more options. Or 40 markers can be type 2, where it will say evaluate, discuss, assess, any of those words, a perspective's view on a certain type of inequality. So for type 2, it could be assess the feminist explanation of gender inequality, assess the functionalist perspective of social class inequality, or even broader, assess Marxist explanations of inequality. Something that I forget to mention in this video, which is really important, your contradicting paragraphs, which I go on to explain, needs to come from big theories, big ideas. So it needs to come from those Marxists, those feminists. In the 40 markers, you're not using smaller studies like you look at in paper 1 and studies that you use for the 20 marker. It's your big theories. I go on to explain doubling up, which you'll see. When you double up, that's when you're going to use your small studies that you've learnt for paper 1 for your 20 markers. For all questions, all 40 markers, all types, the structure is an intro, your paragraph 1, your paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 is a evaluation of paragraph 1. Paragraph 3, paragraph 4, the evaluation of paragraph 3, and then paragraph 5, paragraph 6, which is the evaluation of paragraph 5, paragraph 7, and then a critical conclusion. The critical conclusion, just a fancy word for basically another evaluation of the previous paragraph, but just sum it up and say to conclude. So yeah, that is 9 paragraphs, but the intro is very small and they can be small paragraphs. I'm going to look at those paragraphs individually and I'm going to tell you the structure of each paragraph, but it does differ for the type 1 question or the type 2 question. Reading this intro back, the one I'm just about to show you, my example, I am aware that it looks like a lot. If you're someone who's struggling for time already, don't feel like you have to write as much as what I'm just about to show you. This is like an optimum intro. It's not a realistic one, it's just something so I can show you what I'm getting at. Obviously, if you have the time, please write something like this, but if you don't, prioritise your main paragraphs because that's where you'll pick up the most marks. Firstly, for type 1 questions, your intro needs to explain the statement. It needs to explain what the statement means, but also where that statement's coming from. What theory does that statement sound like? You know, this statement comes from a Marxist perspective. This statement comes from a functionalist perspective. Because, and then give a little history, a little context to the theory, to the perspective. So this statement resonates with Marxist views because it outlines bourgeoisie, capitalism, which is what Marxism is founded on, is based on. You give a little word, like little sentence that just goes, Marxism was created as a force against the bourgeoisie in the 18th century. I don't know, I'm not a history person. Whenever Marxism was created, just so the examiner knows that you know your stuff, which obviously I don't, it's been a year. So if the question is a type 1 question, so it assesses a view, the statement, like assess the view that in the UK, status and financial reward is based on individual talent or effort, you start with a theory which agrees with this view. You would say, Young, writing as a functionalist, agrees with this view. The next thing you say is you explain why. So you explain, why does Young agree, or why does this theory support this statement? When you're writing about why it agrees with the statement, you've got to use specific examples from the theory or the study. So if you were talking about Oakley, you'd have to get in canalization. It's those key words you've got to get in your explanation to why this person agrees with this. If you have time and you're aiming for those A stars, those full marks, use another study. This is called doubling up. Choose someone who supports Young even more, that you're not going to mention, someone smaller, and say, this is further illustrated by, by Parsons. And then you say, why does Parsons and Young's theories work together to support this view? The last thing you'll do in your paragraphs is application. And application is crucial, especially when it's a type 1 question, when it's a view, a statement question. You apply the study or the theory to the statement in the question and explain why that they support the view. So if the question was something to do with the underclass, it was a statement containing, saying that social class inequality exists because of attitudes of individuals around work. You would say, if you doubled up, both these studies therefore can demonstrate how yes, social inequality, such as class inequality, exists due to the behaviours of the underclass as well as the state, which reinforces a culture of dependency. Something along those lines, which just further explains why the person you've chosen relates to that statement in the question. Then you do it exactly the same, just with someone that contradicts that statement. This is why the 40 markers can be difficult, because you're not choosing another person or another study that disagrees with the previous person you've just talked about. You're choosing someone who disagrees with the statement. You've got to be careful that you're not saying, this person disagrees with Young. You've got to say, this person disagrees with the statement, therefore disagreeing with Young. It's not a contradiction to the study before, it's a contradiction to the statement. That's each of the paragraphs. The last thing you do is a critical conclusion. And the critical conclusion should answer the question directly. Because it's a statement, we've got to attack that statement and answer that statement. So the way I go around this is I say, so, to conclude, while the view in the question, so while individual efforts and talents may lead to lower class positions, there are arguments to be made, e.g., and then you list the arguments that you've made that contradict this, that go against this. And then you need to give your final criticism. Save the strongest to last. Save the criticism that just completely washes away that statement. So there are arguments to be made, previous arguments, as well as Marx, who says, and then you need to sum it all up by applying it once more to that key statement. So this view that, quote the statement, may be weak as it fails to acknowledge, and the bit it fails to acknowledge is the previous study you've just given. So fails to acknowledge Marx's take, Marx's view that the bourgeoisie, that capitalism is truly to blame. Intros for type 2 questions. So again, type 2 is perspective-led questions. You need to give a brief outline of the theory in the question. So if it was feminist explanations of gender inequality, just give a little sentence that just tells the examiner you know what feminism is. Feminism refers to the movement of sex-based injustices. If you have the time, you say feminism took off in the 70s. It's a leading perspective of the current modern age, but sex injustice, gender inequality still exists. So you've got to explain what the perspective is and give some light on where that inequality stands at the moment. So if it was feminist view on gender inequalities, it's important to say gender inequalities exist. So I would say something like, it's clear women are disadvantaged in society even now because of trends in income, trends in employment of women. There you go. There's your intro. You just need to give a bit of backstory of the perspective and backstory of the inequality it's asked you to talk about. So even if it wasn't feminism, if it was Marxism and it was talking about class inequality, explain briefly what Marxism is, explain what class inequality is. Not necessarily what it is, but explain where class inequality stands now. Is it an issue? Yes. So Marxism is this, focuses on class inequality because it still exists. It's still relevant today. You know, give some stats, give some contemporary evidence of how we know it still exists. Type 2 questions, paragraphs, look like this. Firstly, you need to pick a study or a person, a theory, which explains this type of inequality. So let's say it is the feminist question that I was talking about. This is a good one because I would do each paragraph from a different strand of feminism. So I would pick a study, a person. At the top of my head, I'm thinking Anne Oakley, okay? One explanation comes from the liberal feminist view, where thinkers such as Anne Oakley suggest gender inequality exists because. So why does gender inequality exist? Well, Anne Oakley says this. When you're talking about what Anne Oakley says, what any theory says, use keywords. For every theory, go through all your theories, all your studies, pick 2, possibly 3 words that just sum it all up. You know, Oakley, canalization, manipulation, gender inequality. Choose those words, get them in your essays and explain what they mean. Again, I would use contemporary evidence and doubling up using another theory. So if I'm talking about liberal feminists, I'm probably going to choose another liberal feminist to back up Oakley. Or I'd use contemporary information. So I might give some statistics on the number of women in childcare professions. It doesn't even have to be statistics, just the trend. So more women are in childcare professions. And you need to apply. Applying is so necessary. So you sum up why that theory, why that study, why that person believes that this inequality exists. Therefore, these studies can be used to explain the feminist explanation of gender inequality, as it argues it exists due to lack of legislation, gender norms within the family. Next, unlike type 1 questions, your contradicting point needs to be a perspective or theory which disagrees with the previous point made. Because there's no statement in the question, it needs to be the previous point made. So in this case, it needs to disagree with Oakley. However, functionalists are critical of the liberal feminist explanation that gender inequality exists due to gender norms within the family and argues feminists fail to see biological factors for inequality. And then you give a study to justify this. This is the view of Parsons, who, you explain his view, you explain a study, using those keywords, doubling up if you can, contemporary information, and then apply. So, functionalists reject the idea that gender inequality is caused by, what was that previous point just made, norms in the family. Rather, it's a biological constraint. Rather, it's Then, finally, your last point, like type 1 questions, is going to be your critical conclusion. You answer the question directly. So, in conclusion, feminists believe gender inequality exists because of, and then name your points. So, gender norms, patriarchal control, social media, legislation, anything. You just outline what you've said in all your previous paragraphs. And then you're going to give your final criticism. However, the new right are critical of this as they don't look into the class aspect of gender inequality. The new right fill this gap by suggesting, I'd talk about Murray and single mothers, his view on that. And then good old applying. So, feminist perspective fails to give an explanation which examines the underclass, suggesting it is not a complete or substantial explanation of gender inequality. That last sentence, remember it, because you can change the words around and you can use it for any essay. You've got to end it by saying it's not a complete explanation. It's not substantial enough because it failed to acknowledge the point I just made. So, there you go. 40 markers can be type 1 questions or type 2 questions. They are the same structure as a whole, but there are certain things that you need to change depending on what question you get. Once you've got this, 40 markers are good. My advice is to basically plan out any one you can possibly get, because there isn't an endless amount of essays that you could be asked, because it's only going to be on the perspectives that you know and the inequality that you know. Make rough plans for all possible perspectives, all possible inequality types. Good luck!